Silas Croft watched her from the snow-dusted pine ridge. A woman in a worn coat struggled to set up a meager camp, clearly ill-equipped for the mountain winter. His own buried grief stirred. Her vulnerability could cost her everything in this harsh land. That evening, in the quiet of his remote cabin, Silas Croft cleaned his rifle. The rhythmic click of metal on cloth filled the silence, a sound as familiar as his own heartbeat. Dust motes danced in the firelight, catching the gleam of the well-oiled barrel. Each motion was deliberate, honed by years of solitude and the mountain's harsh demands. His cabin was sparse, functional, a testament to a life stripped bare. No soft fabrics, no decorative touches, only what was essential for survival. He remembered a time when warmth had filled these walls, not just from the hearth, but from laughter. Clara, his wife, had hummed as she worked, her presence a beacon against the wilderness. Her hands, once so capable, had grown cold in his own. He recalled the winter when the fever had taken her, and with her, their unborn child. He had blamed himself ever since, the guilt a heavy stone in his chest, driving him deeper into the isolation of the mountains. He had thought that here, removed from the world, the memories might fade. They never did. Silas finished with the rifle, setting it carefully by the hearth. His gaze drifted to a small, hand-carved compass resting on a rough-hewn table. He had carved it for Clara, a promise of a future they would build together, a new North Star for their journey. Now it was merely a relic of what was lost, a tangible echo of a past he could not outrun. Her image flashed in his mind, pale and frail. He remembered how her last breath hitched, a faint sound that still haunted his nights. That woman, Elara Vance, down by the ridge, reminded him of Clara's fragile strength. He wondered what brought Elara to this unforgiving place alone, so unprepared. The question burrowed into his quiet thoughts. Later that night, at the base of the ridge, Elara Vance huddled close to her small fire. The flames cast flickering shadows against the canvas tarp that served as her only shelter, offering little warmth against the encroaching cold. She carefully coaxed a struggling ember, adding tiny slivers of pine, her breath a visible puff in the frigid air. The fire hissed and crackled, a small defiant sound in the vast silence of the wilderness. The forest around her was a tapestry of unsettling sounds. The snap of a twig, the rustle of dry leaves, the distant, mournful howl of a wolf. Each noise seemed amplified by the darkness, a reminder of her precarious position. Elara gripped a small, worn trowel, her knuckles white. She had come here with a purpose, a mission that dwarfed her fear, but the sheer scale of the mountains pressed down on her with a tangible weight. She knew the dangers, had read about them, yet facing them alone was a different trial. She drew her knees closer, burying her chin against them, forcing herself to breathe slowly. The fire continued its struggle, mirroring her own. The night would be long, and the mountains showed no mercy to those who came unprepared. Elara knew she must hold fast to her resolve, for the wilderness would test her at every turn. Dawn broke cold and clear the next day, painting the eastern peaks in hues of pale gold and rose. Silas Croft returned to the pine ridge, his presence as silent as the falling snow. He had risen before first light, driven by an unnamed restlessness that had stolen his sleep. From his hidden vantage point, he observed Elara Vance. She was already at work, a small figure moving methodically around her makeshift camp, despite the pre-dawn chill. Silas noticed her movements were less frantic than the day before, but still lacked the practiced efficiency of one accustomed to the wild. She struggled with a heavy log, attempting to notch it with a small, inadequate axe. He saw the poor quality of her tools, the thinness of her canvas, the lack of a proper shelter. A familiar unease stirred within Silas. It was the same hollow feeling that had festered within him since Clara's passing, the regret of things left undone, of moments when he had stood by and watched. He had learned that watching often led to failure, to loss. He watched Elara struggle, her breath forming small clouds with each swing. He noted the determination etched on her young face. This woman was stubborn, perhaps foolishly so, but there was a quiet fire in her spirit. His own inaction felt heavy, a choice to remain in the comfortable prison of his grief. Could he simply watch her fail, knowing the mountains would not forgive such missteps? The wilderness offered no second chances. and Elara was clearly in over her head. The subtle shift toward curiosity became a nagging concern, a quiet challenge to his ingrained solitude. Mid-morning saw Elara Vance still laboring, her hands aching from the unfamiliar work. She paused, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of a gloved hand. Despite the chill, she needed her larger felling axe, a tool she had carefully packed and cached beneath a rock outcrop near the stream, along with her spare canvas and a small bag of dried meat. She walked toward the stream, her steps crunching on the frozen ground, eager to retrieve the heavier axe that would make her work much easier. When Elara reached the outcrop, her heart sank. The rocks were scattered, haphazardly tossed aside. The canvas was ripped, half buried in a shallow snowdrift. Her heart pounded with a cold dread. She frantically dug through the disturbed snow, her fingers numb. The felling axe was gone. The dried meat was gone. Her small, carefully hoarded bag of medicinal herbs, intended for her research, was gone too. Her stomach twisted into a knot. This was not merely an inconvenience, it was a devastating setback. She sank to her knees, staring at the empty space. She had planned meticulously, had accounted for every contingency, or so she thought. Now, with her critical tools and supplies missing, the mountains felt less like a challenge and more like an indifferent, crushing force. The full extent of her vulnerability washed over Elara. A single mistake could doom her entire venture. This is a moment when a careful heart chooses patience over fear. She struggled to maintain her resolve. Without that axe, without the extra canvas, winter would quickly claim her small, vulnerable camp. What would she do now that her essential gear was gone, leaving her exposed and ill-equipped? Silas Croft, observing from the ridge, saw Elara's sudden distress. He watched her frantic search, saw her collapse to her knees, a small, defeated figure against the vast, indifferent landscape. The sight struck him with a familiar ache. He knew that posture, that quiet despair. He had worn it himself for 2 long years. He remembered Clara's last days, her body wasting, her breath growing shallow. He had watched her struggle, helpless, feeling the cold hand of fate closing in. The memory, faint yet sharp, pricked at his conscience. Elara's plight was a harsh mirror, reflecting the fragility of life in these unforgiving mountains. Her failure, he knew, would likely mean far more than just losing her claim. It would mean losing her life. The thought unsettled him deeply. His ingrained isolation, the protective shell he had built around his grief, began to crack. He had sworn off attachments, sworn off involvement, believing it was the only way to avoid further pain. But watching Elara, a nascent urge to help pulsed through him, a defiance against the emptiness that had defined his world. He battled his internal resistance, a war between the ghost of his past and the flicker of a new purpose. Can he break his own rules to prevent another tragedy, or will he retreat into the shadows of his own sorrow? Early afternoon brought a sharp drop in temperature. A biting wind began to whip through Elara's camp, rustling the thin canvas of her makeshift shelter. Dark clouds, heavy and ominous, gathered quickly over the mountain peaks, promising a blizzard. Elara shivered, wrapping her worn coat tighter around herself. Her fingers, still numb from searching for her lost supplies, felt stiff and unresponsive. She inspected her meager shelter, pulling at a loose rope, tightening another. The canvas flapped wildly. It was flimsy, barely adequate for a light snowfall, let alone the kind of storm brewing in the sky. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it would not withstand the impending gale. The missing felling axe, the absent dried meat, the stolen herbs. They all felt like a death sentence now. Her original plan, however daring, had accounted for basic necessities. But this new crisis had stripped her of vital tools for survival. Elara's options dwindled with each gust of wind. To stay meant facing the storm without adequate shelter, without proper provisions, almost certainly without hope. To leave meant abandoning her claim, her mission, and her brother's legacy, admitting defeat to the unforgiving mountains. The cold dread mounted, turning her resolve into desperation. She realized she was in over her head, dangerously so, without help. The mountain was closing in, and with a storm on the horizon and no shelter, what desperate choice would she make? The first fat flakes of snow drifted down from the darkening sky, promising a long and bitter night. Elara Vance frantically pulled at a canvas sheet, attempting to secure it over her precarious lean-to. Her hands, already raw, fumbled with the knots, her breath forming quick, desperate clouds in the rapidly chilling air. A rising wind tugged at the fabric, threatening to rip it from her grasp. She was losing the race against the mountain, the looming blizzard a stark reminder of her inadequacy. A sudden thud of hooves in the deepening white startled her. Elara spun, reaching for the small rifle she had leaned against a half-built timber frame. A figure emerged from the swirling curtain of snow, leading a pack horse laden with supplies. It was the man from the ridge, Silas Croft, his silhouette broad and unmoving against the white. He dismounted without a word, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He began to unload. Heavy canvas rolls, a coil of stout rope, a small sack of nails, and a wrapped bundle of dried meat appeared on the snowy ground. Elara held her rifle steady, its cold metal a small comfort in her trembling hand. She told him she did not need charity. Silas looked at her, his eyes unreadable, and said it was not charity. He spoke of neighborly sense, explaining that the storm would rip her canvas clean off by midnight. Elara asked him what his price was, neighbor. He met her gaze then, and in his eyes Elara saw something that made her finger ease from the trigger. It was a loneliness that recognized its own reflection. The wind picked up, howling like a hungry beast, as Silas Croft moved with quiet competence. He ignored Elara Vance's lingering suspicion, his focus entirely on the task at hand. He unrolled a section of thick canvas, heavier than anything Elara possessed, and began to secure it to the existing frame. Silas worked quickly, his calloused hands tying knots with practiced ease, reinforcing weak points that Elara had entirely missed in her haste. Snow accumulated on the brim of his wide-brimmed hat, melting into dark streaks on his grizzled beard. He did not speak again, allowing his actions to explain his presence. Elara watched him, her rifle still held loosely in her grip, her mind a whirlwind of distrust and desperate relief. She observed the way his muscles flexed under his worn buckskin coat, the steady rhythm of his hammering as he drove new nails into the timbers. Silas seemed to know exactly where the mountain would test their defenses, anticipating the storm's next move. He showed her with a gesture where to hold a corner of canvas, and Elara, despite her reservations, complied. The air grew colder, and the world outside the small, increasingly fortified shelter became a blur of whitened sound. Silas was a man of the mountain, moving with its logic, and for the first time since her arrival, Elara felt a flicker of true hope. By full dark, the small shelter was battened down, groaning but holding against the relentless wind. Silas Croft tied off the last rope, testing its strength with a powerful pull. The structure, no longer a flimsy lean-to, felt solid, a fragile but definite defense against the raging blizzard. Silas then walked to his pack horse, retrieved a small blanket, and returned to the makeshift entrance. He gestured for Elara Vance to enter, then followed her inside. They huddled near the small, struggling fire Elara had managed to keep alive, its warmth a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. The firelight danced on their faces, revealing the weariness etched in Elara's features and the stern resolve in Silas's. Elara shivered, drawing her knees to her chest. She asked Silas who he was. His voice was rough from disuse as he gave her his name, Silas Croft. Elara thanked him, Mr. Croft. He nodded once, then stared into the flames. The storm raged outside, a living, roaring entity, but inside a quiet breath of safety had taken hold. A cautious peace settled between them, built on shared peril and unspoken needs. Anyone listening in the dark notices a warmer space and keeps it close. The worst of the blizzard passed sometime after midnight, leaving only a fading, mournful wind. The snow had slowed to a gentle fall, and a faint, ethereal light began to filter through the heavy clouds. Silas Croft stood, stretching the stiffness from his limbs. He retrieved his saddle and bridle from the corner, moving with the quiet efficiency Elara Vance had come to observe. He was preparing to leave. Elara watched him, a knot forming in her stomach. She felt a strange mix of relief and an unexpected sense of loss. He had saved her, asked for nothing, and now he would simply disappear back into the vast, silent mountains. As he reached the opening, a silhouette against the clearing snow, Elara called out to him. Silas paused, turning his head slightly. She asked him again who he was, wanting more than just a name this time. He simply stated his name again, Silas Croft. He did not offer an explanation for his help, nor did he ask for anything in return. With a final brief nod, Silas mounted his horse and rode silently into the pre-dawn gloom, disappearing as quickly and mysteriously as he had arrived. Elara stood in the entrance of her now secured shelter, watching his departing shadow, a lingering confusion warring with a burgeoning curiosity in her heart. The moon had set by the time Silas Croft reached his cabin. He unsaddled his horse with numb fingers, the cold seeping into his bones despite the strenuous work. His cabin, usually a sanctuary of quiet solitude, now felt different. The silence that had once been a comfort, a shield against the world, seemed subtly less comforting, almost empty. He unrolled his bedroll by the fireplace, the familiar ritual offering little solace. The hand-carved compass lay on his small table, its needle pointing north, an unchanging constant in his solitary life. Silas looked at it, then at the dying embers in the hearth. He thought of Elara Vance, her fierce determination, her trembling hands, the way she had looked at him with wary suspicion, then with a glimmer of something akin to trust. Silas remembered the warmth of the small fire in her shelter, the shared space, however tense. He had acted without thinking, a reflex born of instinct and a buried memory of Clara, his lost wife, and their child. He had vowed to remain apart, to let no one else experience the pain of his failure. But Elara's plight had pierced through his self-imposed isolation. Silas wondered at his own unexpected actions, a fissure forming in the walls he had carefully built around himself. The silence of his cabin now echoed with an unfamiliar question. The next morning broke clear and cold, the mountains sparkling under a fresh blanket of snow. From his vantage point on the Pine Ridge, Silas Croft watched Elara Vance's camp. He saw her emerge from the now sturdy shelter, a small figure against the vast, indifferent wilderness. She moved with a renewed purpose, inspecting the reinforced canvas, touching the ropes Silas had tied. He noted the way she paused, a slight smile touching her lips as she looked at the secure structure. Elara walked around the perimeter, her steps firm, a visible sense of relief in her posture. Silas observed her, a silent acknowledgement of his work, and more importantly, her renewed resolve. He had secured her camp, provided her with the means to weather the storm, but her determination remained her own. The mountain was unforgiving, its beauty a harsh mistress, and Elara Vance, despite her vulnerability, seemed to understand this now with a deeper clarity. Silas saw her pick up a small, forgotten tool, her movements steady. She was ready to continue her struggle, not just survive it. He felt a faint, unfamiliar stir in his chest, a subtle shift from the emptiness that had defined him for so long. Later that morning, Silas Croft sat in his cabin, cleaning his rifle again, the rhythmic action of familiar comfort. Yet his thoughts kept drifting back to Elara Vance. He had helped her, against his own rigid code of isolation, and now a strange pull lingered. Silas found himself drawn to the ridge once more, as if an invisible thread connected him to the small, distant camp. He mounted his horse, riding through the sparkling snow, the silence of the forest a stark contrast to the questions swirling in his mind. From the ridge, he saw a faint, new trail leading away from Elara's camp, a small sign of her continued journey. She was pressing on despite the blizzard, despite her meager supplies. Silas looked at the winding path, then at the vast, snow-covered landscape. He battled the familiar guilt, the memory of Clara like a wall between him and the living world. Helping Elara felt like a betrayal, yet riding away felt like a different kind of failure. Silas was torn between riding down and riding away, guilt warring with a nascent curiosity he could not deny. The trail led to an unknown future. 2 days later, Silas Croft approached Elara Vance's camp, not from the familiar Pine Ridge, but directly along the game trail. The air was crisp, the sky a clear, unblemished blue, a stark contrast to the recent blizzard. Elara knelt by a half-fallen log, attempting to saw through it with a small, dull-looking handsaw. The effort showed on her face, a grim determination that tugged at something deep within Silas. He dismounted, his movements quiet and deliberate, the crunch of snow under his boots the only sound. Elara looked up sharply, her eyes widening in surprise as she saw him. Her hand instinctively moved towards a small axe resting nearby. Silas noticed the wary tension in her shoulders. He pulled a larger, sharper felling axe from his pack horse, its head glinting in the mid-morning sun. He simply held it out, handle first. Elara studied him, her gaze direct, searching for motives. She asked why he was there. Silas said he saw her struggle with the timber and that her saw was too small for such work. He added that winter would not wait for slow progress. Elara hesitated, then took the axe from his outstretched hand, her fingers brushing his briefly. A flicker of something passed between them, quickly extinguished by the cold air. She looked at the heavy axe, then back at Silas. She asked what he wanted in return for such a tool. Silas said he wanted nothing beyond common sense prevailing. He pointed to the precarious angle of the half-built shelter. He said it would not hold against the next heavy snow. Silas Croft pointed out the flaws in her current shelter, the uneven logs, the gaps in the canvas, the lack of a proper foundation. He spoke with the quiet authority of long experience, his words practical and unadorned. Elara listened intently, her initial suspicions slowly giving way to a grudging respect for his knowledge. She knew he spoke the truth about the shelter's weaknesses. The memory of the blizzard, though past, still chilled her. She had barely survived. Silas explained that deeper winter would bring heavier snows and colder winds. He said a proper cabin would take time to build. He then offered to help her build a sturdy, permanent shelter, one that would withstand the mountain winter. He said it would go up quicker with 2 pairs of hands and the right tools. Elara's gaze swept across the imposing mountains, then back to the small, vulnerable structure she had managed to erect. She was fiercely independent, her journey into these remote lands a testament to that resolve. Yet the stark reality of her situation, the approaching cold and her missing supplies, weighed heavily on her. She had come to find a plant, not to become a victim of the elements. Silas Croft waited patiently for her answer, his expression unreadable. He understood the pride that might make her refuse. He also saw the desperation she tried to hide. Elara considered his offer, her distrust warring with the desperate, undeniable need for competence and strength beyond her own. She asked him again why he would offer such help to a stranger. Silas simply said no one should face the mountain alone. Elara knew the mountains did not care for lone spirits. She knew what was at stake. That evening, a small fire crackled in Elara Vance's makeshift hearth, casting dancing shadows on the new, sturdier canvas Silas Croft had helped secure. The aroma of pine smoke mingled with the scent of coffee, a small comfort against the encroaching cold. Elara, finding herself in a rare moment of vulnerability, began to speak more openly about her purpose in the mountains. She explained she was not merely a settler, but a botanist, searching for a rare medicinal plant known to thrive in this high altitude. Her voice carried a quiet passion as she described the plant's unique properties, its potential to heal. Silas listened, quietly intrigued, a flicker of scientific understanding in his practical mind. He had lived in these mountains for years, knew the flora and fauna with an intimate familiarity, but he had never considered the deeper purpose behind a plant's existence beyond sustenance or basic use. Elara described the specific characteristics of the plant, its delicate leaves, the way it clung to north-facing slopes. She spoke of her lost brother Ben, who had begun this research, his notes hinting at the plant's precise location. She felt a profound obligation to continue his work. Silas asked a rare, thoughtful question about the plant's appearance, confirming details he might have seen but never truly noticed. Elara unrolled a piece of parchment, revealing delicate sketches of various plants, some marked with precise coordinates, others with annotations in a neat small script. The firelight illuminated her earnest face, reflecting her hopeful expression. Silas felt a subtle shift within him, a recognition that her quest was born of something more profound than mere survival. He watched her carefully, a quiet understanding growing between them. A few days later, Silas Croft made a rare trip to the nearest small mountain trading post, his buckskins blending into the rough-hewn interior. He needed winter supplies, heavy canvas, and more nails for the shelter. The air inside was thick with the smell of cured hides and stale tobacco. He found old Finn, a grizzled prospector with eyes like chipped ice, leaning against the counter, whittling a piece of cedar. Finn was a fixture of these parts, a man who knew the mountains and their secrets. He watched Silas with a knowing gaze. Old Finn observed that Silas had been seen riding near Willow Creek, a place Silas usually avoided. Finn then subtly inquired about the new woman in the hills, asking if she was planning to stay. There was an undercurrent of suspicion in his tone, a reflection of the isolated community's wariness toward strangers, especially those who were alone. Silas kept his responses terse, simply stating she was building a home. He bought his supplies, the sacks heavy in his hands. Old Finn lowered his voice, speaking of recent troubles, of men who were not particular about how they acquired land or resources. He warned of claim jumpers who would soon be sniffing around any new settlement. He mentioned a name, Jedediah Stone, a man known for his ruthless methods and an insatiable hunger for territory. Silas Croft nodded, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He had heard of Jedediah Stone before, a man who represented the darker side of frontier ambition. Finn's cryptic advice felt like a foreshadowing of trouble already brewing. Silas knew Elara was unprepared for such men. The next morning, back at Elara Vance's camp, the rhythm of their work began to take shape. Silas Croft, with his long experience in the mountains, demonstrated efficient log-notching techniques, showing Elara how to read the grain of the wood, how to place support beams for maximum strength. Sawdust flew in the crisp air as Elara, quick and eager to learn, followed his instructions. Her small hands, though calloused from her journey, moved with a newfound precision under his guidance. He taught her about the properties of different timbers, the best way to fell a tree without wasting wood, the crucial importance of a level foundation. Their movements became synchronized, a quiet, unspoken understanding growing between them. There were moments when their hands brushed while passing a tool, a momentary unnoticed spark. Silas felt it, a faint jolt, but he pushed the sensation away, focusing on the task at hand, on the rising walls of the shelter. Elara, too, felt the brief contact, a warmth she quickly attributed to the physical exertion. Silas Croft observed her fierce determination, her unwavering focus. She absorbed his lessons with an intensity he had not expected. He had spent years alone, building his own cabin, relying solely on his own strength and knowledge. Now working alongside Elara, he found a different kind of strength, a shared purpose that made the labor lighter, the isolation less profound. The shelter was slowly taking shape, a testament to their combined efforts. He saw her growing confidence and admired her resilience. Later that day, returning from checking his trap lines, Silas Croft encountered Jedediah Stone. Jedediah was not alone. Two of his men, rough-looking and heavily armed, patrolled the remote game trail with him. Jedediah's eyes were like flint, hard and assessing. He stopped his horse in Silas's path, a sneer on his face. He spoke of the mountain's bounty, of its resources, and of those who respected its unwritten rules. He then made a thinly veiled threat about new settlers infringing on established territory. Jedediah's voice was low, but it carried an unmistakable menace. He spoke of new faces appearing in places they did not belong, of claims that might not be as legitimate as their owners believed. His gaze lingered on Silas, a challenge in his hard eyes. Silas Croft met his stare, his own face unreadable, stoic. He said nothing, simply held Jedediah's gaze, a silent defiance in his posture. He knew Jedediah was testing him, staking his claim on the fear of others. Jedediah Stone chuckled, a dry, humorless sound, and then spurred his horse forward, his men following close behind. Silas watched them go, his hand unconsciously resting on the hilt of his hunting knife. The encounter left a bitter taste in his mouth. Jedediah was not a man to be trifled with, and his words were clearly a warning, not just for Silas, but for Elara. The mountains had a new predator, one more cunning and dangerous than any beast. Silas knew he had to protect Elara. That evening, in Elara Vance's newly built shelter, the small space felt warm and secure, a temporary refuge from the growing chill of the mountain air. Silas Croft returned, quietly disturbed by Jedediah Stone's veiled warning. He ate his supper in thoughtful silence, his mind replaying the encounter. The external threat felt more real now, less a distant rumor. He looked at the hand-carved compass he always carried, its smooth wood worn by time and handling. Elara noticed his quiet demeanor and the compass in his hand. She remarked on its unique craftsmanship, the intricate carvings on its casing. She asked where he had found such a beautiful piece. Silas said it had been his father's. Elara then pulled out a small, carved item from a pouch she wore around her neck. It was a fragment of a similar compass, clearly broken from a larger piece, but bearing the same distinctive hand-carved pattern. She explained it belonged to her lost brother Ben. A careful heart understands that some connections defy simple chance. This piece, she said, was all she had left of him. She spoke of how Ben had been fascinated by navigation, always trying to find a true north, not just on maps, but in life. Silas Croft looked at her, then at the two compass pieces, his own and the fragment in her hand. The similarity was undeniable, astonishing. He felt a jolt of recognition, a deep, surprising connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. The world felt smaller, more intertwined than he had ever imagined. Elara's hopeful expression held a silent question. This small, broken artifact pointed to a shared mystery and a path neither of them had anticipated. Silas Croft arrived at Elara Vance's camp with the first sliver of dawn. The air still held the sharp bite of early winter, but the sky promised a clear day. The cabin, though small, now stood sturdy, its walls complete, awaiting the roof. Silas dismounted without a word, his movements fluid and efficient as he began to unload the heavy timbers he had prepared the day before. Elara Vance was already at work, splitting kindling with surprising strength, her breath misting in the cold. Her movements were less practiced than his, but her determination matched his own quiet resolve. They fell into a rhythm. Silas hoisted the heavy ridge beam into place, his muscles straining but sure. Elara handed him tools, her hands quick and precise, anticipating his needs. He taught her how to set the rafter notches just so, demonstrating with a few swift axe strokes. She watched absorbed, then replicated the motion with a focused intensity. Sunlight began to spill over the mountain peaks, painting the fresh-cut logs in warm hues of gold and rust. The sounds of their work, the soft thud of axe on wood, the scrape of saw teeth, became a steady drumbeat in the quiet wilderness. Silas observed Elara closely as they worked. She was learning fast, her initial awkwardness giving way to a more confident grace. He saw the strength in her shoulders, the unwavering focus in her eyes. It was a strength born of necessity, he understood, much like his own. Silas made a dry comment about a particularly stubborn knot in a log, a rare moment of levity. Elara paused, a genuine laugh escaping her, a sound light and unexpected against the mountain quiet. It was a sound Silas had not heard in a long time, and it resonated within him, a subtle warmth in a place long cold. The shared effort of building together created an unspoken harmony between them, a fragile bridge across their solitary lives. Silas felt a comfort he had not sought, nor believed possible. A few days later, Silas Croft rode to the distant general store in the valley, a necessary trip for powder and shot. The trip was always a chore, a reminder of the world he had left behind. Inside the dusty store, the air was thick with the scent of coffee, kerosene, and unwashed wool. A small group of townsfolk huddled near the potbelly stove, their voices low, then rising in sharp bursts. Silas kept to himself, selecting his supplies, but his ears, accustomed to the silence of the mountains, caught snippets of their conversation. Jedediah Stone stood among them, his voice a low, insinuating rumble. He spoke of new arrivals in the hills, of claims and intentions. Silas heard his own name, then Elara Vance's, linked with suspicion. Jedediah spoke of questionable women and men who lost their way. The townsfolk nodded, their eyes darting toward Silas, then away. Silas felt the familiar prickle of judgment, the weight of a community's unspoken rules. His sudden reappearance from years of isolation, now in the company of a solitary woman, was fodder for their idle tongues. Silas paid for his goods, his expression unreadable. He knew the way these things worked in the valley. A spark of rumor, fanned by someone like Jedediah Stone, could quickly become a wildfire. He felt a hardening within him, a quiet defiance against the whispers. These were not his battles, he reminded himself. Not truly. Yet the thought of Elara Vance facing this kind of scrutiny alone stirred a protective instinct he had thought long buried. Silas left the store, the hum of gossip fading behind him, but its chill lingered in the crisp air. That evening, inside the now completed cabin, Firelight danced on the log walls, painting the small space with warmth. Silas Croft and Elara Vance sat by the hearth, the mountain wind a distant sigh outside. The work was done for the day, and a companionable silence filled the cabin, heavier with unspoken thoughts than any words could be. Elara spoke first, her voice soft against the crackle of the fire. She told Silas more about her brother Ben and the rare plant he had been seeking before his death. She spoke of his passion, his quiet dedication to discovery, a trait she clearly shared. Elara explained the plant was rumored to grow in hidden pockets of the higher peaks, a powerful medicine that could ease fevers and lung sickness. Ben had carried old maps, she said, sketches of the mountains marked with faint crosses, trying to pinpoint its location. She believed her brother had been close to finding it. Silas listened, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames, but his thoughts were entirely on Elara Vance's earnest face. He understood the fierce loyalty that drove her, the need to complete a loved one's unfinished work. He recognized the echo of his own deep sorrow in her quiet words. Silas then found himself speaking, a rare occurrence. He spoke of his own past, a fragment of the pain he carried. He mentioned a winter long ago, a harsh season that had taken much from him. He spoke of the emptiness that followed, the way the silence had become a shroud. He did not speak of Clara, his wife, nor of their lost child, the full truth still a raw wound he could not expose. Yet sharing even that much felt like an immense weight lifting from his chest. Elara did not pry. She simply listened, her eyes warm with understanding, a silent acknowledgement of shared loss. A fragile trust formed between them in the quiet glow, a delicate bridge built not with logs, but with shared vulnerabilities. Silas glanced at his hand-carved compass, sitting on the small table nearby, its wood warm in the firelight. He felt a subtle shift within him, a softening he had not felt in years. The quiet rhythm of their breathing filled the space, a testament to a growing connection. This is a moment when a careful heart chooses patience over fear. The next morning, old Finn appeared at Silas Croft's cabin, an unexpected sight. Finn was a man of the mountains, weathered and wise, whose visits were rare and usually carried purpose. Silas offered him coffee and Finn accepted with a grunt, his keen eyes sweeping across the cabin interior. Finn spoke of the valley, of the rumors that had begun to circulate. He named Jedediah Stone, his voice low and serious. Finn said Jedediah had been making inquiries, asking about Elara Vance's claim, questioning her right to be in these hills. Jedediah had a reputation, Finn warned, for underhanded tactics, for using legal loopholes and intimidation to get what he wanted. He spoke of how Jedediah had driven off other settlers before, always finding a way to make their lives miserable until they gave up their land. Silas listened, his jaw tight. He knew Jedediah was a snake, but he had not considered the man would target Elara so directly, so soon. Old Finn explained Jedediah coveted the land near the Willow Creek, a strategic location for trapping and possibly future mining interests. Elara Vance's presence was an inconvenience, and her lack of local connections made her an easy target. Finn's words were direct, offering no frills, only the hard truth of the mountain world. Silas absorbed the information, his mind already turning over ways to counter the threat. The quiet peace he had found in Elara's company felt suddenly fragile, exposed to the harsh realities of human greed. The next morning, Silas Croft rode to Elara Vance's cabin, the warning from old Finn heavy on his mind. He dismounted and immediately sensed a disturbance. Elara stood outside her cabin, her hands buried in her hair, her face pale with a mixture of rage and fear. Her research notes lay scattered on the ground, and several small leather pouches, usually filled with carefully collected specimens, were empty. Elara turned to Silas, her eyes wide with fury. She told him her collected plant specimens were gone, including the rare ones she had found just days before. The thieves had rummaged through her things, not taking anything of obvious value, but specifically targeting her work. Her voice trembled as she spoke, a raw vulnerability beneath her usual determination. She knew who was behind it, she declared, her eyes flashing with renewed anger. It had to be Jedediah Stone. This was not just theft, it was a direct assault on her mission, a violation of her very purpose in the mountains. Silas felt a cold anger settle in his gut. Jedediah Stone was not just threatening Elara Vance's land, he was attacking her life's work. This was a different kind of fight, more personal, more malicious. Silas looked at the overturned research notes, the empty pouches, and then at Elara's distressed face. He saw her dream, her brother's legacy, threatened. He spoke then, his voice low but firm, a promise in its quiet tone. He would find them, he said. He would get her specimens back. Silas Croft set out immediately, his tracking skills honed by years of wilderness living. The fresh snow, a blessing in disguise, clearly showed the tracks of 3 men and a single pack horse leading away from Elara Vance's cabin. Silas followed the trail silently, his rifle resting easy in his hand. The cold air filled his lungs, sharpening his focus. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a predator, his senses alert to every snap of a twig, every rustle in the pines. The tracks led him about 5 miles out to a rough, temporary campsite tucked into a sheltered ravine. 3 men huddled around a small, smoky fire, their faces unfamiliar, their movements sluggish with drink and carelessness. One of them held a familiar leather pouch, idly tossing it in his hand. Jedediah Stone's men, just as Silas had suspected. Silas emerged from the trees, a silent shadow against the white landscape. He spoke in a low, even tone, his words carrying a cold authority that cut through their drunken stupor. He demanded the return of the stolen specimens. The men, startled and unnerved by his sudden appearance and quiet menace, fumbled for their weapons. Silas did not raise his rifle, but his stance, his unwavering gaze conveyed a promise of swift and decisive action if they resisted. He delivered a warning, cold and clear, about what would happen if they ever bothered Elara Vance again. Their bravado crumbled. The leader, a burly man with shifty eyes, handed over the pouches, his hands trembling slightly. Silas recovered every single specimen, his gaze fixed on each man until he mounted his horse and rode away. He left them with their shame and a chilling understanding that some lines were not to be crossed. That night, Silas Croft sat by the fire in his own cabin, the reclaimed specimens carefully wrapped and set aside for Elara Vance. He should have felt a sense of satisfaction, of purpose fulfilled. Instead, a familiar emptiness gnawed at him, complicated now by a new kind of guilt. He had dreams that night, vivid and unsettling. Clara, his lost wife, appeared in them, her face pale and distant. He reached for her, but she was always just beyond his grasp, fading like smoke. Silas woke with a start, the image of Clara still lingering. His thoughts turned immediately to Elara Vance, to the laughter they had shared, to the fragile connection forming between them. A wave of guilt washed over him. He questioned if his growing feelings for Elara, his desire to protect her, was a betrayal of Clara's memory. Was he dishonoring the past by reaching for a future? His hand went to the hand-carved compass on his table, its smooth wood cool beneath his fingers. He felt torn between the memory of his lost love and the burgeoning hope Elara represented. The weight of his past pressed down on him, threatening to pull him back into the familiar, safe isolation he had known for so long. Silas Croft arrived at Elara Vance's cabin site in the early morning light. A cold silence rode with him. His usual methodical movements were stiff, his gaze distant, fixed on some unseen point beyond the rising sun. Elara, already tending a small cook fire, watched him approach. She saw the familiar lines of his weathered face, but something new weighed down his shoulders, a shadow that even the bright morning could not chase away. She sensed his withdrawal immediately, a subtle barrier rising between them where a fragile bridge had begun to form. He went to the stack of logs without a word, picking up an axe. His swings were efficient, but lacked the focused energy she had come to recognize. Elara watched him for a long moment, the crackle of her fire the only sound. His averted gaze felt like a physical absence in the small clearing. She knew this man carried burdens, had seen glimpses of them in the storm, but this renewed distance felt like a quiet retreat, a turning away from the path they had started to forge together. Elara's voice was gentle when she finally spoke, a soft current in the crisp air. She asked him if the mountain wind had bitten too deep last night. Silas paused, axe head resting on a log, and turned. His eyes met hers briefly, then shifted to the distant ridge. He mumbled something about a restless night, about old thoughts stirring in the darkness. The words were vague, reluctant, like stones carefully placed to block a path. Elara waited, knowing more lay beneath the surface. A deeper truth he kept locked away, tied to his past. She saw the quiet cabin interior reflected in his troubled eyes. Later that morning, as they worked on fitting a new support beam, Silas's mood remained heavy, casting a chill over their shared labor. Elara noticed his hands were less steady than usual, his movements tinged with an internal distraction. She laid down her hammer, stopping the rhythmic thudding that usually filled their mornings. She looked at Silas, her gaze steady, full of a quiet wisdom that belied her years. She understood that grief could bind a person tighter than any chain, but she also knew it could not be allowed to strangle life itself. Elara told Silas that grief was not betrayal. She spoke of how the dead did not wish for the living to die alongside them, to become ghosts haunting their own days. Her voice was soft but firm, a stark contrast to the rough silence that usually surrounded Silas. Her words were simple, yet they landed with the force of a physical blow, cracking something deep within Silas's chest. It was a truth he had denied himself for 2 long years, a permission he had refused to grant. Silas stood frozen for a moment, the heavy timber he held forgotten. His breath caught, a silent acknowledgement of the pain and release her words brought. He could not speak, the confession too raw, too profound. He simply nodded, a single jerky movement, his head bowed. He felt a tremor run through him, not of cold, but of a long frozen river beginning to thaw. He then returned to work with a new intensity, a quiet ferocity. He was building not just a cabin, but something within himself. The warmth of the hearth now felt like a promise. Mid-afternoon found Silas Croft and Elara Vance high on the cabin roof frame, meticulously laying out rafters. The air had been still, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow. One moment the sky was a clear, crisp blue, and the next, a wall of white descended without warning. The world disappeared into a sudden, blinding blizzard. The temperature plummeted with terrifying speed, stealing their breath. Wind howled like a living thing, tearing at the few canvas coverings they had stretched over the incomplete walls. Silas shouted instructions, his voice barely audible above the roar. He pointed to a gap in the roof, motioning Elara to help secure it. Their movements became frantic, desperate efforts against the overwhelming force of nature. They scrambled down, sealing themselves inside the still half-finished cabin. Canvas walls flapped violently, and cold seeped through every crevice. The small stove, usually adequate, barely held its own against the plummeting mercury, its heat quickly swallowed by the raw exposure to peril. They pushed heavy logs against the door and braced the canvas windows, fighting to keep the storm out. The howling wind rattled the timbers, and snow hissed against the raw wood, threatening to breach their fragile sanctuary. Silas moved with grim determination, his face set. Elara worked beside him, her fear evident but her hands steady. The storm was a raw exposure to peril, forcing them into extreme proximity, stripping away everything but the immediate need to survive. Elara turned to face Silas, her eyes steady and clear in the dancing firelight. Her words hung in the air like a dare, a challenge to the years of self-imposed exile he had embraced. She told him to stop watching and start living. The simple phrase resonated through Silas, shaking him to his core. He looked at her then, truly looked, and saw someone as broken and brave as himself, someone who understood the ragged edges of sorrow and the fierce will to survive. He leaned forward, tentative, terrified yet utterly compelled. He kissed her. It was a kiss born of shared vulnerability, of confession, and of a raw, undeniable connection. Elara froze for a heartbeat, a moment of breath held in the howling storm. Then she returned the kiss, her lips soft against his, answering his silent plea. The cabin around them was unfinished, wind still whistling through the gaps in the walls, but a warmth existed here now that went far beyond the small stove. When they finally pulled apart, neither spoke. They did not need to. The unspoken meaning of their kiss filled the space, a silent promise woven into the fabric of the storm-battered cabin. It was a connection that transcended words, a fragile, beautiful thing forged in the crucible of shared loss and newfound hope. It was a new beginning, marked not by a grand gesture, but by the tender courage of two souls finding solace in each other. Morning came clear and bright after the storm, washing the mountain in a pristine layer of fresh snow. The air was crisp, still, and held the promise of a new day. Silas Croft and Elara Vance worked differently now. Their movements were more synchronized, their awareness of each other a constant, subtle hum beneath the surface of their practical tasks. They were careful not to name what had shifted between them, but the change was palpable, a quiet understanding woven into their shared silence. At noon, old Finn arrived on horseback, his breath pluming in the cold air. He had ridden out to check on Silas, his old friend, after the blizzard. Finn dismounted, his gaze sweeping over the secured cabin, then settling on Silas and Elara. A knowing look passed between the old prospector and Silas, a silent acknowledgement of the new dynamic. Finn's weathered smile held a touch of wry amusement, a wisdom that saw beyond the immediate present. Finn spoke of the town talking, of how news traveled faster than any horse in these parts. He mentioned whispers, hints of Clara Whitfield, the town matriarch, having her claws out, ready for gossip. Silas's stomach sank, a familiar dread returning. He knew his horse had been spotted at Elara's property overnight. Innocent explanations would not matter to people hungry for scandal. Elara, however, looked at Finn with a newfound defiance. She said firmly that they could let them talk. Silas remained silent, but his quiet resignation spoke louder than her defiance, anticipating the coming storm of human judgment. Silas Croft rode into the nearest settlement, the small collection of buildings quiet under a pale early winter sun. He needed fresh salt for his traps and some flour for the cabin. A knot of men gathered near the general store, their voices low but sharp, drawing his eye. He recognized Jedediah Stone among them, his lean frame radiating a smug satisfaction. Silas kept his distance, dismounting his horse by the livery, but the wind carried fragments of their talk. Jedediah spoke of new arrivals, of women who built homes in the wilderness without proper backing, suggesting an unseemly independence. One of the townsfolk, a thin man named Thomas, nodded eagerly, adding his own whispers about Silas Croft, the recluse, suddenly appearing in town with a reputation for helping the woman at Willow Creek. Silas felt the familiar prickle of unwanted attention, the judgment in their glances. They spoke of impropriety, of land grabbing, of how certain individuals brought ill repute to the respectable valley. The men seemed to take pleasure in their condemnations, painting Elara Vance with words that soiled her character. Silas heard his own name linked to hers, a new kind of shame curling in his gut. The quiet life he had cultivated for years, a shield against the world, now felt exposed, vulnerable to their wagging tongues. His shoulders stiffened beneath his coat. The community's disapproval was a force, not a gentle breeze, and it gathered speed. A week later, the gathering storm of gossip broke in the town square. Jedediah Stone had orchestrated a public meeting, ostensibly about community standards, but truly a trial for Silas and Elara Vance. Silas stood amidst a circle of hostile faces, the cold mountain air doing little to cool the animosity. Jedediah, positioned prominently, addressed the crowd, his voice carrying an oily authority. He spoke of the importance of order, of tradition, and then turned his hard gaze on Silas Croft. Jedediah asked Silas to explain his association with Elara, raising questions about her character and the nature of their partnership. The accusation was clear, heavy with insinuation, designed to force Silas to choose. Silas felt the weight of every eye, the years of his own isolated respectability pressing down. He attempted to defend Elara, saying she was a respectable settler, a hard worker who deserved a chance, but his voice lacked conviction, a hollow echo against Jedediah's smooth lies. He stammered, searching for stronger words for an argument that would cut through their prejudice. He thought of Clara, his lost wife, and the fear of social censure that had always held him captive. This sudden public scrutiny, aimed at destroying Elara, paralyzed him with a familiar dread. His mind raced, seeking a safe path, a way to appease the crowd without betraying Elara, but no such path existed. He hesitated, his gaze sweeping over the judgmental faces, and in that hesitation, everything crumbled. He could not find the courage to speak the full, unwavering truth, to shout down the gossip with the force it deserved. His own self-doubt, his ingrained fear of judgment, held him silent for too long. He saw Elara then, standing a short distance away near the mercantile doorway, Her basket of supplies clutched tight. Her eyes met his across the square. For a breathless moment, the world narrowed to just them. She saw his failure, the way he chose their approval over defending her, and something inside him died a little. He had betrayed her. Elara Vance saw the truth in Silas Croft's faltering stance, in his silent concession to the town's judgment. Her expression, which had held a flicker of hope, hardened into a mask of wounded pride. She did not speak. She did not cry. Instead, she turned from the scene, her movements deliberate and unwavering. She walked to her horse, tied patiently at the hitching post, and mounted with a quiet grace. The crowd murmured, their attention shifting from Silas to Elara, but she ignored them all. She gathered the reins, her back straight, her chin held high. She looked neither at the men nor at Silas. Silas watched her go, a cold dread spreading through his chest. He tried to call her name, a desperate sound caught in his throat, but no words came. He recognized his failure, stark and complete. He had chosen the empty approval of a prejudiced town over the brave woman who had begun to thaw his frozen heart. He felt a profound sense of loss, sharper than any he had known since Clara's death, because this loss was self-inflicted, born of his own cowardice. The silence of her departure was louder than any accusation. She spurred her horse, and in moments, she was riding away, a solitary figure disappearing down the trail toward her cabin, taking with her the fragile hope Silas had just begun to embrace. The crowd began to disperse, leaving Silas alone with the bitter taste of his mistake. Silas Croft followed Elara Vance, his horse laboring up the snowy trail in the late afternoon. He reached her cabin, the smoke no longer curling from its chimney, and dismounted. He walked to the door, his heart heavy, and raised his hand to knock. Before his knuckles could connect, Elara's voice came through the thick wood, flat and devoid of emotion. She told him that he chose their approval. She added that she chose herself. Her voice was steady as stone as she said they were done. She instructed Silas to leave. He stood there, stunned by the finality of her words. He tried to speak, to offer an apology, an explanation, anything to bridge the chasm his weakness had created. But the door remained shut, unyielding. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than any blizzard, colder than the deepest winter. He had found a glimmer of life again, a purpose beyond his grief, and he had destroyed it with his own fear. Silas felt the familiar, crushing weight of loneliness descend once more, but this time it was a punishment, not a sanctuary. He recognized this place, this emotional barrenness, as a grave he had carefully dug for himself. He turned from the door, defeated, and mounted his horse, riding back toward his own empty cabin. Later that afternoon, Silas Croft found himself walking toward the town's small notary office. He had a vague excuse about checking on a property line, but a deeper, unsettling curiosity pulled him. He entered the quiet office, the scent of old paper and ink thick in the air. He saw Jedediah Stone there, a triumphant smirk on his face, handing papers across the counter to the notary. Silas froze, hidden in the shadows of the doorway, observing. Jedediah spoke, his voice dripping with false concern, mentioning Elara Vance by name. Silas listened as Jedediah filed a formal legal claim against Elara's property. Jedediah cited incomplete residence, noting that the cabin, though improved, still technically lacked full completion, a flimsy pretense for his greed. He also mentioned some vague, unsubstantiated claims of Ben Vance's unpaid debts, painting Elara as financially irresponsible. The notary, a portly man with tired eyes, reviewed the documents and stated the terms. Elara had 2 weeks to finish the cabin and prove permanent occupancy, or she would lose the land, and Jedediah's claim would be considered valid. Silas felt a fresh wave of despair, a cold certainty that Jedediah's malice knew no bounds. He watched Jedediah leave, his victory clear, and then Silas slipped out of the office. The notary none the wiser to his presence. The ticking clock of the deadline now echoed in Silas's mind. That evening, Silas Croft sat alone in his cabin, a whiskey bottle on the rough-hewn table. The fire in the hearth struggled, mirroring his own spirit. He had succumbed fully to his grief and guilt. The warmth Elara had brought now a distant memory. He poured another measure, the amber liquid offering only a fleeting numbness. He felt nothing, a hollow man in a silent cabin. The world outside, the mountains, the town, Elara, all seemed distant, unreachable. Old Finn appeared in his doorway, his weathered face grave. He walked in without an invitation, settling himself on a stool across from Silas. Finn looked at the bottle, then at Silas, his eyes holding a direct, unwavering gaze. Finn spoke quietly, reminding Silas that Elara had woken him up. He told Silas that he was choosing the grave again, retreating into the self-imposed death he had lived for 2 years after Clara died. Finn's blunt accusations landed like a blow, stirring a tremor in Silas's numb heart. Silas had no answer, only the bitter taste of whiskey and regret. The mountain man sat in quiet defeat, the compass on his table reflecting the firelight, its needle pointing nowhere that mattered to him. 10 days passed since Silas Croft left Elara Vance to her isolated struggle. The deepening winter had wrapped the mountains in a tighter, colder embrace. Elara worked alone at her half-finished cabin, the air sharp with the bite of frost, each breath a cloud against the gray sky. She nursed a painful saw-slip injury, a deep gash across her palm, wrapped poorly with a strip of canvas. The wound throbbed, a constant reminder of her solitude and the unforgiving nature of her task. Every swing of her hammer sent jolts of pain through her arm, but she continued, her movements slower, less precise than before. The cabin frame stood skeletal, a testament to what had been started and then abandoned. Snow gathered on the exposed roof beams, a heavy, silent burden. Elara felt the dream of home slipping through her fingers like fine mountain dust. Her supplies dwindled and the cold seeped into her bones, mocking her fierce determination. She remembered Silas Croft standing by her cabin door, his face a mask of regret. He had chosen the town's approval, leaving her to this impossible fight. The memory of his words, of his hesitation, felt colder than the wind. Elara's eyes, once bright with scientific curiosity, now held the deep, weary shadows of exhaustion. She chopped what little firewood remained, each log split with a grunt of effort. The sun dipped behind the western peaks, casting long, purple shadows across the valley. Night brought not rest, but only more cold, more hunger, and the gnawing fear that she would not survive this mountain winter. She looked at the small fragment of her brother Ben's compass, feeling its smooth, cold wood in her uninjured hand. It offered no warmth, no comfort, only the memory of another lost dream. She knew she was losing this battle against both the mountain and the unseen hand of Jedediah Stone. The cabin groaned with the wind, a mournful sound that echoed her own diminishing hope. Meanwhile, in his own cabin, Silas Croft spiraled deeper into a self-imposed isolation. His ranch thrived, the cattle fed, the fences mended, but Silas felt nothing. He moved through his days with the mechanical precision of a well-oiled machine, his hands busy, his mind numb. The whiskey bottle had become a frequent companion on his rough-hewn table, a liquid solace that offered only a temporary, dull oblivion. Silas Croft found a chilling emptiness in the success of his ranch. The quiet cabin, once a refuge, now felt like a prison. He worked from dawn till dusk, then sat by the fire staring into the flames, the hand-carved compass lying untouched beside him. Its intricate details, once a connection to his lost Clara, now felt like a heavy weight, a monument to a past he could not escape and a future he had thrown away. He recalled Elara Vance's face, her quiet strength, her raw disappointment. He had chosen the path of least resistance, the path of silence, and it had led him back to this barren place. He felt no joy in his solitude, only a profound weariness. The world outside his walls seemed distant, a canvas on which other lives unfolded, while his own remained stagnant, a still portrait of grief and regret. Silas Croft had built a functional world for himself, one where pain was kept at bay, but it was a world devoid of living breath. The next morning, old Finn arrived at Silas Croft's cabin unannounced, finding Silas staring blankly at a plate of cold breakfast. Finn sat opposite him, his grizzled face etched with a rare seriousness. He watched Silas for a long moment, the quiet tension filling the small space. The old man spoke, his voice gruff but clear, cutting through Silas's indifference. He told Silas that Clara, his lost wife, would be ashamed of him right now. Finn continued, explaining that her shame would not be for moving on, for finding a new path, but for giving up entirely. The words landed like a physical blow to Silas Croft. He felt it deep in his chest, a sharp, unexpected pain that pierced through the numbness he had cultivated. Finn spoke of Clara's fierce spirit, her hope for their life, how she would have wanted Silas to live, truly live after her. He said she would never have wished for him to bury himself alive alongside her memory. Silas remained silent, stunned by the old man's brutal honesty. He had spent 2 years believing his loyalty to Clara meant living in perpetual mourning, that to feel anything else was a betrayal. Finn's words twisted that belief, exposing it as a cowardice, a surrender. Silas Croft looked up, meeting Finn's unwavering gaze. The old man offered no comfort, only the unvarnished truth. He simply stated that a man only dies once, but he can choose to live or die every day. He then went to the stove, poured himself a cup of coffee, and waited. Silas felt the raw wound of his guilt, but now a flicker of indignation sparked within him, a protest against the grave Finn accused him of choosing. He considered the depth of Elara Vance's courage, remembering her steady defiance even when alone. Old Finn's challenge had found its mark. This is a moment when a careful heart chooses patience over fear. That afternoon, Silas Croft rode his horse through the falling snow, not towards his traps nor back to his cabin, but to a remote, snow-covered cemetery high in the hills. He dismounted, the only sound the soft crunch of his boots on the pristine white, and walked to a simple, weathered headstone. The name Clara was carved there, beneath a date 2 years past. He stood before it, snow gathering on his hat brim and shoulders, a silent vigil. He spoke aloud, his voice rough with disuse, but steady despite the tremor in his hands. Silas Croft confessed his enduring love for Clara, Maggie, his voice breaking slightly as he said her name. He told her he would always love her, that she and their lost baby were forever a part of him. But then, a new truth emerged, a difficult, painful confession. He admitted to her that he was still alive, and that for too long he had been choosing wrong. He had chosen fear, chosen grief as a shield, chosen a slow, quiet death instead of living. He touched the cold stone, feeling the biting chill against his glove. Silas Croft admitted that Elara Vance made him feel alive, that she stirred something within him he thought had died with Clara. He believed deep in his heart that Clara would want that for him, a chance to live again, to find warmth and purpose. It was a permission granted to himself, from himself, an acknowledgement that honoring Margaret did not mean dying slowly, but rather living fully, embracing the messy, unpredictable path of life. The heavy weight of years of guilt began to lift, a tangible shift in the cold cemetery air around Silas Croft. The snow continued to fall, cleansing the landscape, and with it, perhaps, his soul. He turned then, a new resolve setting his jaw. Silas Croft returned to his cabin as evening fell, the light fading to a deep indigo. He walked to his table, his gaze falling upon the hand-carved compass. Before, it had been a relic of loss, a reminder of Clara, and a symbol of his aimless wandering through grief. Now he saw it differently. Its steady needle, pointing always north, no longer felt like a tether to the past, but a guide to a new direction. He picked up the compass, its smooth wood warm in his hand, a stark contrast to the cold stone he had touched earlier. Silas Croft understood that his true north was not a fixed point on a map, but a direction of living, a path of connection and purpose. Elara Vance had become a new North Star for him, not replacing Clara, but illuminating a future that honored his past by embracing life. The compass now represented a commitment to finding not just a physical location, but a place in the world where he belonged, where he could protect, and where he could truly live. He felt a quiet determination settle deep within him. Silas Croft knew what he must do next. He would not watch anymore. He would act. Later that evening, Silas Croft rode straight to town. He dismounted outside the saloon, the only source of light and noise in the quiet settlement. Inside, he found a boisterous gathering, Jedediah Stone holding court near the bar, likely discussing his fraudulent claim against Elara Vance. Silas pushed open the doors, his entrance silencing the room. Every eye turned to him, the silent mountain man, now a commanding presence. Silas Croft walked directly to the bar, pulled out Jedediah's legal papers he had previously obtained from the notary, and slammed them down. The papers skidded across the worn wood, coming to rest before Jedediah Stone. Silas spoke, his voice clear and loud, resonating through the shocked silence. He declared that Jedediah's claim was built on lies, stating that Ben Brennan's debts had been paid and that he had the receipts to prove it. Silas Croft accused Jedediah of wanting Elara Vance's land, not justice, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the townsfolk. Jedediah Stone sputtered, his face reddening with outrage and surprise, attempting to dismiss Silas's accusations. But Silas interrupted him, his voice unwavering. He declared that Elara Vance was worth 10 of anyone who judged her, calling her braver, kinder, and stronger than anyone in that room. Silas Croft looked directly at the townsfolk, his eyes holding no judgment, only a fierce challenge. He stated that if they wanted to judge her, they should judge him alongside her. Silas announced loud and clear that he stood with Elara Vance. Silas Croft stood his ground, the saloon's noisy atmosphere suddenly thick with silence and unspoken judgments. His declaration had split the room down the middle. On one side, Jedediah Stone's faction glowered, their faces hardened by suspicion and ingrained prejudice. Jedediah's own sneer remained fixed, but a flicker of surprise crossed his eyes. He had not expected such a public challenge from Silas. Across the packed room, Silas met their hostile stares without flinching, a quiet strength radiating from him that many had not seen in years. He had chosen his path, and now the world would have to reckon with it. Other townsfolk, however, shifted their weight, their gazes moving between Silas and Jedediah, a visible uncertainty playing on their features. Some of the younger men, ranchers and tradesmen, avoided Jedediah's eyes. They had heard the whispers about Jedediah's land grabs, the strong-arm tactics. They recognized the cold, hard evidence Silas had presented. The weight of Silas's reputation, earned through years of honest, if solitary living, began to sway those on the fence. Respect for courage often outweighed an appetite for scandal, especially when truth stood so starkly before them. Old Finn, who had been leaning against a wall by the stove, pushed himself upright. The grizzled prospector's eyes, usually narrowed in perpetual skepticism, held a glint of approval. He walked deliberately across the saloon floor, his heavy boots thudding softly, and stopped beside Silas. Old Finn placed a calloused hand on Silas's shoulder. His voice was a low rumble, but it carried through the hushed room. He said he would help finish that cabin. The saloon, once a den of gossip and judgment, now buzzed with a different kind of energy. Old Finn's simple declaration had broken the spell, and others began to stir. Blacksmith Owen, a burly man with hands like anvils, stepped forward next. He said that he too would help. His hammer, usually wielded for iron, could swing for timber. Rancher Thomas, a quiet man who owned a sprawling spread south of town, nodded his agreement. He spoke of neighborly duty, a value long cherished in the mountains. Soon, a small cluster of men gathered around Silas, their faces reflecting a mixture of concern, newfound conviction, and a desire to right a wrong. They spoke in low tones, discussing what supplies would be needed, how many horses could carry timber, and the best route to Elara's camp. Silas found himself organizing, not with grand speeches, but with calm, practical instructions, his years of mountain experience proving invaluable. He spoke of the rapidly approaching winter, the need for speed, and the strength of many hands working as one. The promise of a new dawn, literal and figurative, began to take shape within the dusty walls of the saloon. Silas, who had spent years avoiding human connection, now found himself at the center of a burgeoning community, rallied by his own unexpected act of courage. He felt a different kind of warmth bloom in his chest, not just from the stove, but from the shared purpose that now bound these men together. Late that night, long after the saloon had emptied and the town settled into a fragile quiet, Silas walked the deserted street. The air was cold and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. He noticed the light still burning in the sheriff's office window. Sheriff Ben Carter had been present at the saloon that evening, a silent observer in the back, his expression unreadable. Silas wondered what the sheriff had made of his outburst, of Jedediah Stone's bluster, and of the growing support for Elara. Silas knew Sheriff Carter was a man who prized order and truth, though he moved slowly, deliberately, like the shifting of rock on a mountainside. He imagined the sheriff now, hunched over ledgers, perhaps reviewing old property deeds, tracing the paper trail of Jedediah's ambitions and Elara's rightful claim. It was a comfort to think that justice, however slow, might be turning its wheels even if unseen. Silas felt a quiet confidence that the sheriff would do what was right once he had all the facts. Dawn broke clear and sharp over Willow Creek the next morning, painting the distant peaks in hues of rose and gold. Silas led a dozen men and several pack horses, laden with fresh timber and tools, up the winding trail to Elara's cabin. The crisp air bit at his cheeks, but a different kind of anticipation warmed him from within. He had ridden this path many times, often alone, often burdened by grief. Today he rode with purpose and with companions. Elara Vance stood at the edge of her clearing, a rifle clutched in her hands, confusion etched on her weary face. She had expected to face Jedediah Stone and his men alone, not this small army of neighbors. Her eyes, shadowed by exhaustion, widened as she recognized Silas at the head of the group. He dismounted and walked toward her, his gaze steady. He spoke her name, a simple apology in his voice, and told her he had been a coward. He explained that they had come to help her build. Elara's eyes, usually so fierce, welled with unshed tears. The rifle trembled slightly in her grip. She looked at Silas, then at the men behind him, their faces earnest and ready. The dam of her fierce independence broke, just for a moment, and a single tear traced a path down her dust-smudged cheek. She nodded once, a gesture of hesitant but profound acceptance. 3 days of hard work transformed Willow Creek. The small community that showed up for Elara Vance was not the whole town, but it was the better half. The air thrummed with the rhythmic thud of hammers, the rasp of saws, and the quiet commands of men working in unison. Walls rose with coordinated effort, each log notched precisely, fitted snugly into place. Silas Croft moved among them, a natural leader, his quiet competence guiding the efforts. He worked side by side with Elara, teaching her to set a ridgepole, to gauge the weight of a beam. Laughter, rare in these isolated hills, rang out across the clearing. Shared meals were eaten by a crackling fire, the simple food tasting sweeter for the collective effort. Old Finn spun tales of grizzled prospectors, and blacksmith Owen offered robust advice on tool maintenance. There was a collective pride in the rapidly taking shape cabin, a communal spirit reclaimed from the grip of judgment and greed. Silas and Elara worked with few words between them, but a constant awareness of each other, a trust rebuilding through every swing of the hammer, every log laid. The cabin became real, solid, a sturdy home built not just from timber and nails, but from shared effort and renewed hope. Silas felt a deep satisfaction, the kind of honest weariness that settled in the bones and quieted the mind. During a break on the third afternoon, Elara Vance led Silas to a secluded part of the nearby slope. She knelt, carefully brushing aside a layer of pine needles to reveal a delicate, bell-shaped flower. She explained it was the rare medicinal plant she had been seeking, a species known to grow only in specific, high-altitude conditions. She spoke of its unique properties, a powerful analgesic and anti-inflammatory, and how her brother Ben Vance had begun to map its distribution before his death. Elara pulled out the small carved fragment of her brother's compass, holding it next to Silas's own. She said Ben had believed the plant's growth was tied to subtle magnetic anomalies, and that his compass, once complete, would have led him to larger veins of it. Silas looked at his own compass, now seeing it not just as a relic of his past, but as a potential key to Elara's future. The compass, he realized, might hold clues to further discoveries, a shared purpose that stretched beyond the immediate goal of building a home. A new north, both scientific and personal, now seemed to point their way. The third afternoon of building brought a sudden, unwelcome chill to the air. Silas Croft sighted down a roof beam, watching Old Finn and blacksmith Owen hoist it into place. A dust cloud on the horizon quickly resolved into 5 riders, cutting across the snow-dusted meadow. Jedediah Stone led them, his face hard and shadowed beneath his hat. He dismounted with a flourish, his 4 hired men fanning out behind him, each with a hand resting near a sidearm. Jedediah carried a roll of papers in one hand and wore a self-satisfied sneer. He declared the property under dispute, his voice carrying an icy edge over the sounds of hammers. He had come for Elara Vance's land. The rhythmic work halted. Hammers fell silent. The men working on the cabin roof paused, their eyes on the intruders. Silas felt the familiar prickle of warning, a tension that always preceded trouble. His gaze swept over Jedediah's hired men, noting their hardened faces in the glint of their weapons. The community that had gathered to help stood united, but also suddenly vulnerable. Men reached for tools that were not just for building, but that could become weapons if needed. Shovels were gripped tighter, axes were held at the ready. Silas knew this was the confrontation they had all feared. Jedediah Stone approached the half-finished cabin, his eyes sweeping over the new construction with a possessive glint. He waved his papers, claiming legal precedent, his voice loud and accusatory. He spoke of Ben Vance's old debts and incomplete residency. Silas stepped forward, moving with a quiet resolve that belied the fury building within him. Old Finn moved to stand beside Silas, his weathered face grim, a heavy maul held loosely in his hand. Blacksmith Owen and rancher Thomas formed a silent line with the other helpers, their faces set. Silas met Jedediah's gaze without flinching. He stated that Jedediah was the only trespasser here, his voice low but firm. The air crackled with unspoken threats. Jedediah's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flash of anger. His right hand twitched, moving slowly toward the gun on his hip. The tension peaked, a taut string ready to snap. Violence was one heartbeat away, a single wrong move separating peace from bloodshed. Silas stood his ground, his eyes unblinking, challenging Jedediah to make the first move. The community held its breath, witnessing this perilous standoff. Elara Vance appeared then, stepping through the line of silent defenders. She walked with a steady purpose, a leather-bound deed clutched in her hand. Her gaze was fierce, meeting Jedediah Stone's sneering face directly. Her voice, usually soft, was steady as stone when she spoke. She declared this was her home, her eyes burning with conviction. She said she was not leaving and that Jedediah was trespassing. Her completed cabin stood solid behind her, a testament to her will, a fortress built by communal spirit. It was physical proof of her residence, proof of belonging, stronger than any greed. Just as Jedediah seemed poised to retort, a new voice cut through the tension. Sheriff Ben Carter emerged from the trees, riding slowly towards them, a quiet observer until now. The sheriff dismounted, his presence an immediate shift in the balance of power. He looked at Jedediah, then at Elara. The sheriff stated that Elara was right. He explained that the council had reviewed Jedediah's claim yesterday, and it was denied. The sheriff's words were clear, authoritative, and final. He told Jedediah he had no business here, and his legal maneuver had failed. This is a moment when careful hearts choose patience over fear. Jedediah's face twisted with a mixture of disbelief and pure humiliation. Jedediah Stone stood frozen, his legal papers now worthless in his hand, his eyes darting between Sheriff Ben Carter, Silas Croft, and the unified faces of the community. He saw he had lost. His hired men looked uncomfortable, their stance softening. Jedediah muttered a frustrated curse under his breath, his plans utterly ruined. He mounted his horse, his face still contorted with humiliation and rage. He vowed that this was not over, his voice a low growl of impotent fury. Silas met Jedediah's retreating gaze, his own eyes holding a quiet certainty. Silas said quietly that yes, it was over. Jedediah, defeated and exposed, spurred his horse and rode away, his men following close behind, disappearing back into the distant trees. The immediate threat had passed. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the gathered helpers. The sheriff nodded once to Silas and Elara Vance, a silent acknowledgement of justice served, before turning his horse and riding back towards town. As evening fell, the helpers began to depart, their tasks completed, their camaraderie lingering in the crisp air. Old Finn clasped Silas Croft's shoulder, a knowing look in his eyes. Blacksmith Owen and rancher Thomas offered their congratulations to Elara Vance, their smiles genuine. Soon only Silas and Elara remained in the completed cabin. Lantern light cast a warm, golden glow on the log walls, chasing away the last shadows of the day. The small space, now sturdy and secure, felt enormous with possibility. Silas admitted he did not know how to do this. his voice rough with a vulnerability he had rarely shown. He confessed he was still scared. Elara replied that she was also scared, but she added that they would build it one day at a time, just like the cabin. Her words hung in the quiet air, a shared promise, a gentle agreement. Silas took her hand, his fingers warm against hers. She did not pull away. They stood together in their completed work, not just timber and nails, but trust and second chances made tangible, a silent pact against the world. Silas Croft pulled Elara Vance close, his arms wrapping around her. This time there was no hesitation, no trace of the fear that had once held him captive. He kissed her, a tender, confident gesture born of shared trials and newfound understanding. Elara responded with equal fervor, their embrace a silent affirmation of their bond. The cabin around them, though finished, was still fresh with the scent of pine and sawdust. Outside, the first stars appeared, pricking holes in the vast, darkening sky. Inside, warmed by their shared breath in the steady glow of the lantern, a true home began. Their intertwined shadows danced on the walls, moving as one. Later that night, by the dying embers of the hearth, Silas sat with Elara Vance. He reached for his hand-carved compass, its familiar weight a comfort in his palm. He then placed it gently beside the small, fragmented piece of compass that had belonged to Elara's lost brother Ben. The two pieces, distinct yet strangely connected, lay side by side. Silas told Elara that his compass now pointed to a new true north. He explained that this north was not just a direction on a map, but a guiding light found in shared purpose and connection, a truth he had learned through her. Elara looked at the two compasses, then up at Silas, her eyes reflecting a profound understanding and acceptance. Tonight the house remembered how to breathe. Their hands touched again, a silent promise under the steady glow of the lantern. Spring arrived like a promise kept. 3 months had passed since the cabin stood complete, a testament to shared will and community strength. Silas Croft stood quietly in the doorway of the cabin, the morning light painting the eastern peaks with gold. Elara Vance was already there, a coffee cup warming her hands, her gaze sweeping over the small world they had built together. A small garden patch, neatly tilled and ready for planting, now lay where deep snow had recently ruled. Silas noticed the subtle changes Elara had made. A sturdy corral for his horse stood ready near the tree line, built with timbers he had helped fell, but finished with Elara's thoughtful details. Curtains, hand-stitched with simple patterns, now hung in the cabin windows, softening the raw wood. These were signs, quiet yet profound, of two lives merging into one. The morning air carried the scent of pine and fresh earth, a stark contrast to the harsh winter winds that had once howled around this very spot. Silas felt a deep contentment settle in his chest, a feeling he once believed lost forever. His own cabin, further up the mountain, remained a place for solitude when needed. But this place, this home, was where life truly breathed. He watched Elara, her profile serene in the growing light, and a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the coffee steam. That evening, the cabin became a beacon of warmth and laughter. Old Finn arrived first, his grizzled face creasing with a rare smile as he stepped inside. Soon after, Blacksmith Owen and Rancher Thomas, along with a few other familiar faces from the valley, gathered around the simple wooden table, the air filled with the aroma of Elara's cooking and the easy rumble of men's voices. Silas watched Elara move through the bustling space, her presence radiating a quiet joy. She handed out plates of steaming food, her eyes bright as she listened to Old Finn recount a tall tale about a bear in a honey pot. Laughter, hearty and genuine, echoed off the log walls, replacing the profound silence that had defined Silas Croft's life for so long. He found himself smiling more, a natural, unforced expression that felt alien yet welcome. These men, once mere acquaintances or distant neighbors, now felt like family, bound not by blood but by shared hardship and a common purpose. This newfound community was a stark difference from his years of isolation. Silas understood that Elara had not just built a home, but she had opened his to a life he thought was forever closed. The next morning, a Sunday, Silas and Elara walked the path to the valley church together, their hands clasped loosely. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. As they approached the small weathered building, Silas felt a familiar tension, a ghost of past judgments. He remembered the hostile stares, the whispers orchestrated by Jedediah Stone. Today, however, the atmosphere had softened. Some glares remained, notably from the remnants of what old Finn called the Clara faction, but their numbers were fewer, their bitterness less potent. Younger families, blacksmiths, and ranchers greeted Silas and Elara warmly, their smiles genuine. Acceptance was not yet complete, but it was undeniably growing, a slow, steady thaw after a long winter of suspicion. Silas felt Elara's hand tighten slightly in his, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey and the path they had forged. The mountain community was learning, slowly, that courage and truth could outweigh gossip and greed. Silas felt a quiet strength in their shared step. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the western peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Silas and Elara sat on the cabin porch. The sturdy logs of their home felt solid behind them, a silent witness to their journey. They spoke of the future, not just surviving but building forward. Elara spoke of expanding the cabin, adding a room, perhaps a small laboratory for her botanical work. Silas listened, his gaze fixed on her earnest face. He spoke of improving the corral, of adding a shed, small practical steps that hinted at a much larger dream. The conversation turned to children someday, a hesitant, hopeful whisper in the fading light. Silas felt a surge of emotion, a feeling of deep purpose that had been absent for so long. The future stretched before them like a blank canvas, ready to be filled with the colors of their shared life. He realized then that his internal North Star, once lost, now burned brightly, guided by her presence. This was a deep, quiet happiness, earned through immense struggle and the choice to fight for what was right. He had never imagined such a peace could find him. Silas looked at Elara, her eyes reflecting the last light of day. He asked her if she ever regretted it, choosing the hard way, the path fraught with blizzards, loneliness, and the malice of men like Jedediah Stone. He saw the flicker of past struggles in her expression, the memory of desperate nights and broken trust. He remembered his own near surrender to grief and isolation. Elara smiled, a knowing, gentle curve of her lips that spoke of deep wisdom. She answered that every good thing worth having came the hard way, forged in the fires of adversity. Her words settled in Silas's heart, affirming the truth he had slowly learned himself. The path they had taken, though arduous, had led them to this moment, to this home, to each other. He recognized the profound strength in her answer, a strength that had mirrored his own transformation. The hard way had not broken them, but rather it had built them, stronger and more whole than they had been apart. Weeks later, as dust settled over the mountain, Elara stood by the cabin door, watching Silas work the corral. He moved with a practiced grace, mending a loose rail, his movements strong and purposeful. The golden light of the fading day silhouetted his form against the backdrop of the towering pines. Elara watched him, a quiet affection warming her. He looked up then, as if sensing her gaze, and their eyes met across the small distance. A rare, genuine smile spread across Silas Croft's face, a smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. It was the smile of a man who had not only learned to live again, but had found joy in the living. Elara smiled back, a silent understanding passing between them. Smoke rose from the cabin chimney, carrying the scent of their home into the cool evening air. The cabin stood solid against the Montana sky, a place of peace and belonging. The hard way had become their way, and in that, they found everything. Spring rain began, soft and renewing, a gentle hush falling over the land. Silas and Elara stood together in the doorway of their home, watching the droplets fall on the newly green earth. Wildflowers bloomed in vibrant patches where winter frost had once ruled, a testament to life's persistent return. Silas felt the familiar weight of the hand-carved compass in his pocket, its purpose now clear, its North Star found. He had built his courage one choice at a time until fear became just another ghost to lay to rest. She had built her cabin one log at a time, each piece laid with stubborn hope against a world that wanted her to fail. Together they had built a home, not just from timber and nails, but from the harder materials of trust earned through action, second chances given and taken. and the quiet belief that even broken hearts could learn to beat again. They stood side by side, watching the land come alive. Tonight, the house remembered how to breathe. A soft wind stirred the curtains, carrying the scent of damp earth and new beginnings.